Good afternoon, everybody, and happy Friday to you. We're with Brian Rourke and Bruce Mitchell. Brian is the original founder of Derby Tidal Energy, and with Bruce, who's a colleague of mine at Here Business and Wealth, Here Capital, and Entrepreneur Australia, who's been working with Brian very closely for the last year on this project. They're here today to talk to us about Derby Tidal Energy and what the project's about, and answer any questions that we might have. To our guests that have joined us today, welcome. Thank you for taking time to join us. So I'm Doug Verley, director, one of the original founders of Here Business and Wealth. And you can visit us on our website, www.herebusiness.com.au, or you can have a look at all of our opportunities on www.entrepreneuraustralia.com.au. So if we can just jump straight into it, Brian, if I can ask you, if you don't mind, to please introduce yourself, a bit of a background, and just a quick snapshot, because we're going to get into some detailed questions and a bit of a presentation as to Derby Tidal and how you got into the project.
Well, my name's Brian Rourke. I'm the Managing Director of Tidal Energy Australia and the companies that are at present looking into the construction of the tidal power station. I've been working on tidal energy since about 1996. I spent a season on a prawn trawler, and I was amazed by the power of the tide, and that got me thinking, and I've been working at starting off as a hobby, and then in 1996 we formed Tidal Energy Australia, and it became a serious business. I'm a mechanical engineer by trade, and I've been working on tidal energy since 1996.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian. We'll obviously get to know more about your background and how the Derby Tidal Energy Project came into being, and the process that you followed and things that you've done and achieved along the way as we progress in our discussion. Bruce, now, as I said a moment ago, you're a colleague of mine. You've worked with Brian for the last year, really grinding through the detail on this project, working on every aspect, but the financial modelling in particular has been quite fascinating. And should we get this off the ground successfully, which I have little doubt that we will, you will become a director on the board to help Brian, and you will drive the financial side, the COSEC side, and you'll also be there to, I guess, look after shareholders and investors that come in and support the building of the project. Can you just give me 30 seconds background as to yourself, and then we're going to step into the presentation, which is up on the screen, and we'll follow with some questions after that.
Good. Thanks, Doug. My background is a South African chartered accountant. Spent most of my 25-year-old career as a financial director of various organizations in Australia, England, Malta, the US, and further afield. And more recently as a CFO and company secretary of a listed entity here in Australia. I went through the IPO with them, and that's where I've sort of cut my teeth locally here in Australia.
Wonderful. All right, thank you. Now, my understanding is that, Bruce, you're going to step through the presentation that's up on the screen. But before we do that, I just want to, for the sake primarily of our international guests that are sort of tuning in from other parts of the world, if you can just please, both of you, Brian, give them a sense of why Derby, where's Derby in relation to other places in Australia, and why specifically are we talking about a Derby tidal project?
Derby started with one of my partners, Peter Wood, wrote a paper for the Minerals and Energy Institute and identified 3 sites in Western Australia. Tidal energy requires a minimum of 7 metres mean tidal range. And the only places in Australia are between Port Hedland and Darwin. A lot of sites have been identified in the Kimberley region, and Derby was chosen because back in 1998, Western Power called for tenders to supply power to the West Kimberley, and we tendered for that project using tidal power because that was one of the best sites for small-scale tidal power, probably in the world.
Okay, all right. So it's sort of Kimberley region up north of Western Australia, and the tides there are, you know, to put it quite bluntly, massive.
Yeah, Derby has a 10-metre tide.
Yeah, extraordinary, extraordinary. Okay, so that in a nutshell explains why Derby, and we'll go into more detail in a moment. Now, I can just sort of share and present it as a question to you both as well, but in discussing Derby Tidal Energy with other parties, external parties, one of the immediate reactions that I get is, you know, will that work, and aren't they largely unsuccessful, and doesn't the sort of wave and tidal activity destroy the technology, destroy the equipment, the machinery? So do we have examples around the world where tidal energy is proven successful, and we can base what you're doing with Derby Tidal Energy on those lessons learned and those examples?
Oh yes, there are several operating tidal power stations around the world. The first one was built in France at a place called Lorence. It has an installed capacity of 240 megawatts and is producing power at less than 2 cents euro per kilowatt hour. It's been operating for 40 odd years now. It's just gone through, or a couple of years ago, went through its first major rebuild. So it's still got another 80 years of life left in it. The newest one is in Korea, just near Seoul. It's called Shewa Lake, and it's slightly bigger than the French one at 254 megawatts. It works the opposite way to the French one, and it was put in mainly to improve the environmental conditions in the lake. The lake was getting very polluted, so they installed the power station, which effectively flushes the lake out and flushed all the toxins and everything out, and the lake is almost back to pristine conditions again.
Fantastic. So we have a number of success stories around the world that we can get into. Now, Bruce, as we go into the presentation that you're about to deliver, I know you're going to cover off on these points, but I just want to make them anyway. At this point, firstly, this is a $375 million CapEx project. So by no stretch of the imagination is it a small initiative, it is substantial. Here Capital is engaged and mandated to raise $150 million in equity. We'll be seeking to raise approximately 70 to 80 million in grant funding. The rest will be debt funding. Investors can look forward to an internal rate of return on average of 15% per annum over a period of about 43 years. So that'll really put up front, straight off the cuff. So really, with that said, can I ask you now to kind of step into the presentation and talk to us about the project?
Sure, Doug. And perhaps before I do launch into the detail, I think an interesting and perhaps an important distinction to make is a lot of people associate tidal with the up and down movement of waves, and that's perhaps where it's got some of its bad name. What we're talking about here with Derby Tidal is the movement of water laterally and the damming of it, and then releasing it through turbines to generate electricity, which is slightly different to what I initially explained in terms of the upward downward movement of the water, where some of the wave technology and tidal technology has been focused in the recent past. Okay, then proceeding with the presentation. Derby Tidal, our vision is a clean energy Western Australia, and that follows through into our mission as well. Investment highlights, Doug, you have mentioned the 15% per annum internal rate of return average over 43 years, a very important aspect of the project, and certainly the equity capital raise. A highlighted figure that we need to focus on also is the cost of power. Brian mentioned a little bit earlier that Laurence produces power at 2 cents per kilowatt hour. We forecast that Derby Tidal will produce it at 1 to 4 cents per kilowatt hour. 1 cent being if we utilize the full capacity from day one, and 4 cents being if we initially start off with about 60% utilization and move up after about 10 years to 100% utilization. So very good cost, way below the current, as we'll go into a bit later, the current cost of producing power. CapEx, you mentioned the 375 million and the split between equity and debt and government. And in terms of the milestones, which again, we'll go into a bit more detail later, all approvals have been obtained with one still required, which we've very far progressed with, and are very optimistic that's going to be wrapped up fairly soon.
So can I just jump in there? Sorry, because I think it's really worth noting. If you want to go back, can you go back? There we go. Just really want to pause on this for a moment, because when I look at this slide, yes, I know it's a massive project. Yes, I know there's lead times in your construction, et cetera, but firstly, a 15% internal rate of return, on average for 43 years. Now, to me, every professional, large fund manager seeking a good investment in renewable energy should be jumping up and down when they see those numbers, because you can tuck that away in the corner of your large portfolio and you just got a steady return year after year after year, and it's low risk. It's risk. The other thing, and not knowing a great deal about the technical side of this, is I believe part of the problem that you're seeking to solve is the use of diesel in that Derby area, and the fact that most of the industry and community is off-grid. So that cost of power at 1 cent to 4 cents, you're going to talk about in a moment, almost a no-brainer. You know, it's crazy.
Yeah, certainly, Doug, and with the current cost of generating electricity in the region being upwards of 30, 40, 50, 60 cents, either using diesel or LNG, LPG, non-renewable in many cases, this does tick a lot of boxes. Renewable, clean, dispatchable, in other words, on demand, at a lower cost, and able to be sold to the users at below the current cost that they are paying.
Yeah, and unlike solar, it's constant energy.
Yeah, the term is dispatchable, so it's available 24/7.
Right, okay. I get pretty excited about this, so I was trying not to interrupt you too often.
Okay, yes, so progressing to what the actual offer involves, 150 million shares of $1 each. So the new shareholders coming in will own 93.75% of the company, and the offer remains open until the end of May. Pre-valuation, money valuation of 10 million, and that's based on costs that Brian and his team have incurred, actual costs over the last few years. There's probably another 10 million further costs that third parties have incurred themselves. So we're probably looking at $20 million already sunk into the project. Post money, the valuation we estimate will be 151 million, and a discounted free cash flow, a nice accounting term, obviously 360 million. Okay, I've got a slide here of an installation, a tidal power installation, and this is Laurence in France. There'll be a few more pictures of it coming up during the presentation as well. Okay, so in terms of the background to the project, it's a renewable energy one. The tidal power station itself will have a capacity of 40 megawatts initially. going up to 48 in the short term, but ultimately the site can handle 100 megawatts. It's in the Kimberley Northwest Coast region of Western Australia. The price of electricity, as I mentioned, to the consumers, it's reduced from the current about 26 to 56 cents, depending whether you're residential or commercial. We are forecasted we can reduce it to 22 cents. And in fact, if we get the full offtake from day one, we estimate we can reduce that cost to 18 cents per kilowatt hour and still return a 15% per annum average internal rate of return. The project life itself, 120 years of generation, 123 years in total, the first 3 years being the construction.
So what does that mean, just as a layman? 120 years, project plant, the tidal plant doesn't disappear in 120 years' time. Is that when it needs or requires significant maintenance and overhauling?
The infrastructure, the buildings and the levees and all those sort of things have got a life of 120 years. The mechanical equipment has an absolute life of around about 40 years, where it's refurbished and reinstalled.
Okay. So again, maybe a question, why do we then talk about an internal rate of return of 15% per annum for 43 years when the project has a life expectancy of circa 120 years? Is it possible that investors could continue to sit in that investment and continue to get that return for more years than 43?
Yes, certainly, Doug. And the reason why we looked at the initial 43 years was it was the initial 3-year construction, the initial 40 years of operation before the major turbine overhaul was necessary. From a modeling point of view, on a financial monthly basis, the model became a bit unwieldy going beyond sort of 43 years. But the return should be at 15% or probably higher beyond 43 years. It was just not in great detail, but I fully expect it to be at least that.
Okay, thank you.
Laurence has reached its 40 years. Its capital has been completely paid off. So now the only cost is the refurbishment, which is minuscule in comparison to the overall cost. And there's no capital to pay off. So they're producing power at around the 2 cents.
And those investors that are still in there can now enjoy a substantially increased return.
Well, that's owned by the French government.
Ah, okay. Thank you.
Doug, thanks for emphasising that 15% per annum. It is a very good return. If you're in the league of Warren Buffett and perhaps Cathy Wood, you're getting the 20%, but that's really up there at the top. So 15% for 40 years and beyond, I think is pretty impressive, and I think it should catch a lot of interest. All right, then perhaps just providing a bit of a before and after sort of snapshot. The current situation is where production is costing around 56 cents perhaps per kilowatt hour. It's difficult to get some of those numbers, and it depends whether you're using diesel or and the size of the generation. It's expensive to purchase, 26 cents for domestic and up to 56 cents for commercial. And as a result of that, there's local industry is constrained, and it has negatively impacted upon the local community. Whereas the situation after Derby Tidal will be quite different in terms of affordability and the renewable nature of the energy we intend generating. So the problem currently that we are solving is that the power is expensive, it's not green, and users up there are not connected to the grid. That comes with its own issues of reliability and cost, and it does have an effect on local industry. And the solution, before we get to the solution, we've got a couple of maps just to provide some reference as to where Derby is. On the sort of northeastern top of Western Australia, and then on the right-hand side you can see where the actual facility is planned and where it fits in just north of Derby and in the King Sound at the juncture of the high and low basin of Doctors Creek. Okay, and the solution, tidal power, as we've mentioned, 1 to 4 cents generation cost and costing 22 cents. It does enable us to harness the greatest tidal range in Australia and a resource that's up to now pretty much untapped. Here's a closer diagram of where the actual facility will fit. And I'll go through a very layman's understanding, and Brian, you jump in if I don't get it quite right, but how it works is water will flow in from the sea into the high basin, Doctors Creek West, which is on the left, through sluice gates, will then close, and the water will be released into Doctors Creek East, the low basin, through turbines and generate electricity, thereafter flowing back into the sea, and that will happen with each time.
The generation is actually between the high basin and the low basin, and that gives us the continuous power, because we're not affected by the slack water at the change of tide.
So this is unique in that it's a double basin setup, whereas Lawrence is not, and this is unique in that it can generate electricity and will generate electricity 24/7. There is neap tides twice a month when the generation is not as high as at high tide, but it still is 24/7. Okay, so obviously a key part of the project is who's going to be the customers, the offtake. Extensive discussions have been had over recent years and are resuming with local offtake in the area, the towns of Derby, Broome, Lumen, and Camberlin. There are numerous commercial operations in the pipeline or currently in operation: mines, abattoir, base, agriculture, refinery, and feedlots. And we anticipate in time more industry and commerce will come to the area because of the low power costs.
One of the attractive things will be producing hydrogen for use in transport.
So just repeat that, Brian, let me understand what you're saying. Producing hydrogen.
Because they're going to phase out diesel in approximately. So the alternative at the moment for heavy haulage appears to be hydrogen fuel cells and electric trucks.
Yes, and to produce hydrogen will consume a lot of electricity.
Yeah, it'll consume it. The beauty of hydrogen is it can consume all the spare electricity.
Ah, okay.
Spare electricity can be used to produce hydrogen. So the whole output of the tidal power station is used to the best advantage.
Yes, okay. And there's a significant sort of number of initiatives underway on the hydrogen front, both across Australia and globally. So, you know, probably from that point of view, it's also timeless.
Correct. Australia has a plan. Their roadmap for the future in terms of renewable energy highlights very specifically and sets a goal of $2 per kilogram for hydrogen. And there's a plan to have a hydrogen highway around the whole of Australia. And production would need to happen in relatively remote areas. And we feel that there's opportunity here for a hydrogen plant using electricity generated by Derby Tidal to produce hydrogen where it's going to be used and needed.
Yes. Is it fair to say that there are other significant industries that have probably been on the cards for some time, but slightly restrained or very restrained and held back by the lack of power in the region?
One of the big things is zinc refining. And the beauty of producing hydrogen, a byproduct of producing hydrogen is oxygen. And oxygen is required in fairly large amounts in the zinc refinery.
Okay. All right. So this is another example, Bruce, of what it might look like. That's probably between the west and the east basins.
Yeah, this is an actual photograph of an existing installation, Laurence, we think. And yes, so Derby Tidal could look similar.
Okay.
All right, so we've spoken about the unique situation that exists up there. The installed capacity being 40 megawatts, but the site capacity is actually 100 megawatts. Double basin format, which is quite unique and enables 24/7 production of power. The tidal capacity itself is 15 gigawatts at the outset, but moving up to 18 gigawatt hours from 2034 onwards. Costs, which are obviously of interest, we touched on the higher capex costs, and that's where the initial investment is. But thereafter, the operating costs of 1.1 million per annum. The variable operating cost is pretty low, and then fixed corporate costs we anticipate to be about $500,000. So a big investment up front, but thereafter very low running costs, and that translates into a low cost of production.
Okay.
The business model itself, 4 cents to currently Western Power producing in that area, or other providers in that area, we estimate are producing at about 56 cents per kilowatt hour. The starting electricity price, 22 cents per kilowatt hour, whereas residential currently are paying 26 cents and commercial are paying up to 56 cents. We've built into our forecast a 2% increase. So ultimately, at the end of the 43 years, power will be costing 51 cents. What we've also factored in is a large-scale generation certificate provided by the Australian government of 4 cents per kilowatt hour, as well as government rebates of 3 million. Then in terms of the generation capacity, as mentioned, we initially will have more than enough capacity, 148% in fact of demand. But towards the end of the project, as more and more consumption gets taken up, it will be down to about 102%. But there is still, as mentioned, the capacity to increase from the 48 megawatts up to 100 megawatts, depending on demand.
So perhaps another silly question or a layman type question. Why would the Western Power or the Horizon Power or any one of the other number of power generating companies, particularly renewable energy type companies, not look at that cost of production and the price at which they deliver it to market and say, this is a no-brainer, we've got to get involved in this project. We want to either have the whole thing or own a large stake.
Horizon Power have got a contract with a gas-fired company to produce the power until 2028. So until that time, Horizon Power haven't got the option of changing.
Okay. And others? There's a number of Australian listed energy companies, renewable energy companies. There's a lot of activity in that sector, and we know that globally, there's over $400 billion a year being invested into renewable energy, predominantly solar and wind, which both have their issues, i.e., sun goes down and the wind stops blowing, whereas the tide, in this case, doesn't stop.
But the tide is totally predictable.
Yeah, and totally predictable. All right, very good.
Doug, you're quite right in highlighting other parties. And Brian's already had discussions with Western Power. I think I'm right in saying, Brian, and they certainly are interested.
Yes, but they will start looking from 2025 onwards for their supply of power in Derby.
All right, well, the price would have gone up by then. Okay, moving on. I'm taking up too much of your time, Bruce.
No problem. And Doug, also there have been other hydrogen producers, local, who we initiated conversations with and remain in discussions with them. And they've expressed an interest, and they've disclosed to us some of their costs, and we are certainly coming in under what they expect to incur with their production or their cost of action. So it's looking very favorable.
Okay.
All right, so the ownership structure, Currently, the investors hold or will hold in the unicorn entity 10 million shares of $1 each. With the raise of 150 million equity, their holding will reduce to just over 6%, without new outside shareholders coming in at 93.75%. A background to, or a high-level view of the use of the funds. Of the 375 million raised, this is the breakdown. A large part of it, as you can see, going into direct capex. We do have some contingency built in there, and also 10 million for working capital. Another photograph of Laurence from the sky, good aerial view. So the financials from a sort of 1,000-yard sort of view. New equity, 150 million to come in, debt of 145, and grant capital provided by state and Commonwealth government of 80 million. The total working capital and capex, 375. Generation will be on average 213 gigawatt hours per annum, with a cost of 44,000 on average per gigawatt, and a sales price of 341,000 per gigawatt hour average over the 43 years. So the accountant to me looks at it and says, well, it's a very nice gross profit. 341 selling price, $44 cost. That's looking pretty healthy. The modeling's been done on all profit being paid out as a dividend, with enough cash kept behind for operations and a bit of a safety margin. And over the 43 years, there'll be 1.8 billion, 1,833 million dividends paid out, generating an internal rate of return of 15% per annum. And the valuation, as I mentioned earlier, on a discounted free cash flow basis over the full 123 years, with a weighted average cost of capital of 7.1%.
Sorry, over how many years?
So the discounted free cash flow that I've done it over 123-year project life.
23, yes, okay.
3 years. The valuation on that basis is 360 million.
Okay.
All right. Now we set out the milestones that we've achieved. There are too many to go through individually, but as you can see, a lot of studies done over the years and a lot of approvals and a lot of modeling done to get us to this point.
You might touch on it in a moment, but as you say, there's been an enormous amount achieved to date over a long period of time. So perhaps it's worth focusing on what still needs to be achieved in the way of approvals to get going.
Currently, the main approval still required is the Commonwealth approval under the EPBC Act, because they have found an endangered shark in the area. So we've been working through that. We're hoping to get our monitoring program approved by the Environment Department in the very near future.
So that's the one key that still has to be dealt with. Otherwise, everything else seems to be taken care of.
Yeah, everything, but we've still got to apply for a building license from the Shire, but that's virtually a formality once you get everything else in place.
All right, thanks, Brian.
Okay, so the team we've assembled, Brian is managing director, and we've heard a bit about Brian's background, and I think he showed us his expertise with all the answers. Joy is a director with business auditing and accounting background, and then Bruce Higgs. Bruce Higgs has been an advisor to government and a lobbyist, and has a great deal of experience on very large capital projects and in energy itself. And then myself, as Doug mentioned, to be elected upon successful offer raising of the equity. And that really concludes the formal presentation. And any questions that may have come through to you, Doug, or we can open to the floor thereafter, we can now answer if you want to pose them to us.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce, and thanks, Brian. That was very good. So yeah, some questions to ask, and I don't really want to go over the whole history of the project. We can see the amount of work that's been put in primarily by you, Brian. Something that has jumped out at me is that some years ago, I can't remember exactly when, grant funding was approved for this project. Can you talk to me about that?
Back when we were tendering for the West Kimberley Power, we approval for a grant from the RRPG, Remote Renewable Power, for a grant of $50 million and a state government grant of $15 million. We couldn't take them up at the time because we didn't win the tender. We came in third behind Energy Equity Woodside joint venture and the Shell joint venture.
And what happened to those projects that sort of came ahead of you?
They couldn't supply the power at the tendered price, so they fell over.
Okay, all right. So that then puts Derby Tidal now in first place.
Yes, but because it's a government thing, it had to go back to tender again. We were in another joint venture, this time with Alstom, Leighton's and Babcock and Brown. We had some problems at the last week of the tenders when we tested the sand, and the big dredging company, Van Orp, a Dutch company, couldn't close the barrage in the neap tide window. So that increased the cost with blowout. And at the same time, in France, Alstom ran into major financial troubles and had to be bailed out by the French government, and they couldn't sign off on the joint venture at the time. So we were unable to put in a tender. Okay, so those are, it's fair to say, those extraneous factors that were completely outside of your control that impacted on your ability to move forward. Yes. Yeah, yeah. All right, so what is the response to Derby Tidal Energy been by federal, local government, local community? Is there support? Is there pushback? Is it something that is being welcomed? It was very welcome in the community at Derby. We had 99% of the people were in favour of it. The shop supported us all the way, and we had a lot of support from government as well. It was unfortunate that with the second time we were unable to put the tender in, but I feel we would have won it if we had it. Okay.
Brian, I think I'm right in saying that those issues with closing the barrage were solved by redesigning, and the costs were in fact reduced. So things were able to progress to the stage we've now got them at.
Yes, yes. We redesigned the whole project after the tender, made it slightly smaller, but reduced the capital cost considerably. We're closing the barrage by end tipping rock instead of trying to do it with a dredge. Right, right, okay. So there are not many obstacles in the way to moving forward now, besides dealing with the shark approval, which in discussions with you, Brian, I think are probably not insurmountable. The raising of the capital, getting the key stakeholders on board at local and government at federal level, and then all systems go. Yes, I think that sums it up pretty well. Okay, and so it is a big project. We're talking about raising a lot of equity capital, $150 million. Can you, and probably you can outline this, Bruce, what are the next steps? How do we see things unfolding from this point?
We have a roadshow planned coming up in April to visit the Derby area. during which we'll present the project to stakeholders in the area and get their further support. That's one of the steps we're going to be focusing on. And then we're going to continue our meetings and discussions with potential offtake parties, namely being mines, hydrogen producers and other industries, and looking for their buy-in in terms of being offtake customers and also potential investors as well. And then continue our current meetings with state and local governments, quasi-governments, the arenas, the Clean Energy Foundation, Clean Energy Finance Corporation, providers of debt, family offices. We've had a couple of meetings there and we're going to continue those. And things are looking quite optimistic on that front. So really attacking it from all sides, focusing on getting investors in and getting offtake sorted out as well.
Yep. All right. And if I can just add to that, it's fair to share with our audience and to those that listen in and watch this video online later on, that we've had a great deal of interest from potential investors to date, which surfaced very, very quickly for all kinds of reasons. We are talking about renewable green energy. We are talking about an area in Australia that has massive development potential. We are talking about a lot of latent industrial potential. We're looking at a 15% internal rate of return for a very, very long period of time. In fact, it's not a high risk type of investment because it's easy to understand, and so on and so on. Now, the kind of investor that Here Capital is looking for, may I suggest to you that we are looking at very, very high net worth, family offices, institutional asset managers, fund managers, private equity type funds, sovereign funds, Australian government infrastructural funds that can happily tuck this money away for many years and are overjoyed to receive a stable, high level of return for a long period of time and be making a very real difference in the life and the well-being of Western Australia and the environment.
Couldn't put it better myself, Doug.
Yeah, and of course, the offer's open, but we are not seeking to take in the $150 million to sit in our Here Capital trust account right now. What we are seeking are firm expressions of interest from the right investors and probably letters of undertaking that when we call for the money is there.
Yes, certainly. And those kind of commitments will go a long way when we speak to potential offtake customers as well.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's wonderful. I think we've had attention of our audience for long enough, and we've covered off on some very key points. People should have an understanding of what Derby Tidal Energy is about. Again, I direct anybody that listens in to entrepreneuraustralia.com.au to have a look at the details surrounding this project. You can contact us directly. You can click on the request button and we will send you copies of the information memorandum. And we invite you to please have a look at all of the other very exciting opportunities that we're currently promoting on entrepreneuraustralia.com.au. Brian, thank you so much for your time, and really congratulations on getting this project to this stage, and years and years and years of effort and dogged determination and capital, actual monetary investment. And Bruce, thank you to you as a colleague. I've seen how hard you've worked on this project, the value that you've added, and how you've managed to really button down the detail. So we're proud to be associated with this project, and thank you for your confidence, Brian, and thank you very much, everybody, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Doug.
Cheers, guys.
Bye-bye.